Michael and Laura Thompson looked like the perfect suburban couple, but behind their smiling photos and quiet evenings was a marriage strained by greed, resentment, and secrets so dark that when Michael won $99,800 in the lottery, it didn't feel like a blessing, it felt like the spark that would ignite the most chilling crime of their lives. David Henson had lived his entire life in the quiet rhythm of a small town where every face was familiar and every routine felt unchanging. He was the kind of man who woke up before dawn, packed the same lunch for work, and clocked in at the manufacturing plant where he had spent over a decade of his life. His world was simple, built on hard work and modest dreams. He never asked for much more than stability. For him, consistency was comfort, but for his wife Clara, that same stability had long since soured into monotony. She often looked at their lives as if she were trapped inside a cage, the bars made not of steel but of disappointment and unmet desires. Clara wanted more excitement, more wealth, more attention, and she had convinced herself that David was the reason none of those things had come her way. Their marriage had been unraveling for years, though neither of them said it out loud. The smiles were forced, the touches rare, and the conversations reduced to routine exchanges. David had convinced himself that things could get better, that perhaps in time Clara would remember what had once drawn her to him. He held on to that hope like a lifeline. What he didn't know was that Clara had already given up on the marriage and saw him only as the obstacle standing between her and the life she thought she deserved. One autumn morning, when the air was crisp and the leaves scattered across the cracked sidewalks, David stopped at a convenience store on his way to work. It was an ordinary stop, the kind he made countless times before, where he picked up his usual black coffee. But something caught his eye that morning. A colorful lottery display sat near the counter, boasting a prize just shy of $100,000. David wasn't a gambler, nor did he waste money on such things, but that morning he felt a strange impulse. Almost without thinking, he asked the cashier to add a lottery ticket to his purchase. He tucked the slip of paper into his wallet with no thought of it ever changing his life. To him, it was nothing more than a fleeting whim, quickly forgotten as he headed to another long shift at the plant. Several days later, as he sat at the kitchen table, weary from work, David remembered the ticket. Out of curiosity, he pulled it from his wallet and compared the numbers to those listed in the newspaper. His hands began to tremble as the numbers aligned one after another, his heart pounding harder with each match. By the time he reached the final number, he realized the unthinkable had happened. He had won. For hours, David sat in stunned silence, staring at the slip of paper as if it might vanish if he blinked too long. The weight of it sank in slowly, followed by a fragile sense of joy. He thought about Clara, about how he could finally give her something more, about how this could be the turning point she had always wanted. In his mind, this money wasn't just for him, it was for them. But while David's heart was filled with hope, Clara's reaction was very different. When she discovered his win through subtle changes in his behavior, through the documents he tried to tuck away, through the slight, almost secretive smile he carried, her own heart didn't leap with joy. Instead, it hardened with resentment and greed. To her, the money wasn't a gift for the both of them. It was his, and the fact that it came to him felt like yet another cruel joke from life. Clara had spent years imagining herself free of David, imagining a life where she didn't have to settle for small paychecks and quiet evenings in their modest home. Now, nearly $100,000 was sitting right in front of her, just out of reach, but not out of sight. And as she thought about it more and more, she began to imagine how easily that money could become hers if only David weren't standing in the way. David, oblivious to the storm building in her mind, fantasized about what he could do. He thought of paying off the small but nagging debts that weighed on them. He pictured repainting the house, maybe taking Clara on a trip, perhaps even rekindling the love that had gone cold. He saw this money as a chance to start over, to finally make things right. Clara saw it as a door she could walk through to a life without David, a life funded by his fortune, where she could finally indulge in the things she had always been denied. In her mind, the money didn't represent opportunity for them as a couple, it represented freedom for her alone. From that moment forward, Clara's thoughts shifted into something darker. The seed of an idea took root, and once it was planted, it began to grow uncontrollably. Every time she saw David smile with that cautious optimism, every time she caught him looking at the lottery paperwork with pride, her bitterness deepened. She didn't feel happiness for him, and she didn't feel gratitude. She felt cheated, as though fate had given the prize to the wrong person. David never saw the danger. He trusted Clara, even with all the distance that had crept into their marriage. He believed that this money might heal what was broken, but Clara had already decided that healing wasn't possible. To her, the only way forward was through his absence. She didn't know exactly how she would make it happen yet, but she knew with absolute certainty that she would. And so, in the quiet of their home, where the walls had seen years of silence and unspoken resentments, Clara began to shape a plan. A plan that would turn David's greatest stroke of luck into the reason for his downfall. What David thought was the start of a brighter future was, in truth, the beginning of his end. David thought he had done everything right by keeping the lottery win a quiet matter. He didn't announce it at work, didn't celebrate loudly in the neighborhood, and didn't post a single word about it. He believed that if he treated it carefully, the money would stretch far and serve its purpose. He wanted to keep it safe, away from attention and away from unnecessary risk. But Clara noticed almost immediately that something had shifted. His movements were lighter, his eyes carried a spark she hadn't seen in years, and there was a faint nervous energy in the way he carried himself. She didn't know the details at first, but she knew something had changed. Clara had lived with him too long not to sense it. It didn't take long before she found the proof. She stumbled across the paperwork one afternoon while rummaging through a drawer. The lottery claim documents were folded neatly inside an envelope, and there was no mistaking what they meant. Clara held the papers in her hands, staring at the numbers and the confirmation of the prize. $99,800. The amount echoed in her mind like a drumbeat. For a moment, her breath caught, and she felt the weight of what she had just discovered. Instead of sharing in David's joy, Clara felt a sharp wave of bitterness. In her eyes, the win didn't belong to him, it should have belonged to them equally, or better yet, to her alone. She had endured years of what she considered a disappointing life, years of unfulfilled desires and tedious routines. Clara told herself that she had suffered enough, and now life was finally offering her an escape. But the cruel irony was that the money wasn't hers to claim. It was locked behind David's name, tied to his decisions. That realization hardened her heart. She decided then that she would do whatever it took to make the money her own. From that moment, Clara began to watch David differently. Every action, every smile, every glance toward the bank paperwork became a reminder that he stood between her and freedom. She felt a strange duality take hold of her. Outwardly, she became more attentive, more affectionate than she had been in years, while inwardly she was consumed by calculation. She began treating him with a sweetness that surprised him. She cooked more meals, asked about his day, even laughed at his tired jokes. David thought the money had already started healing their broken relationship. He felt relief, thinking perhaps their marriage could be saved after all. Clara, meanwhile, was learning more. She peeked into his phone, scrolled through his bank app, and confirmed the deposit of nearly the entire amount. She memorized account numbers, traced his habits, and studied the bank's withdrawal policies online. At night, while David slept peacefully, she sat in the glow of her laptop researching inheritance laws and the procedures for accessing a spouse's money after death. She deleted the history each time, careful not to leave a trail. The planning became an obsession. The more she learned, the more confident she became that she could outmaneuver any obstacle. Yet Clara was careful. She couldn't act suddenly, or David might grow suspicious. She had to wait for the right time, the right moment, the perfect chance to strike. Her patience was fueled by her growing greed, and that greed was relentless. She began imagining the money in her hands. She pictured herself moving into a new house, buying clothes she had never been able to afford, dining in expensive restaurants, maybe even traveling to places she had only seen in magazines. The images played in her mind constantly, and each fantasy made her hunger for the money grow stronger. David, on the other hand, was blissfully unaware of the storm brewing in his own home. He thought Clara was softening because of the win, that maybe she was finally seeing the possibilities he wanted for them. He dreamed of paying off their mortgage, maybe fixing the leaky roof, and taking Clara on a trip to the coast. He imagined long walks on the beach, dinners overlooking the ocean, and perhaps a rekindling of love that had long faded. For him, the money was a way to repair what had been lost. He even started making lists of small improvements he wanted to surprise her with, gestures to show he was still committed. Clara read those lists when he wasn't looking, and every note only deepened her resentment. He was thinking too small, too modest, too ordinary. In her mind, his plans were pathetic, a waste of the fortune that could change everything. Why pay off a roof when she could abandon the entire house? Why settle for weekend trips when she could escape into a whole new life? The thought of watching David squander what she believed was her ticket out filled her with anger. Her mask became her most powerful weapon. She wore it perfectly, smiling at him, praising his ideas, and pretending to share his joy. She told herself she just needed to keep him calm, keep him unsuspecting, until the moment came. Every kind gesture she gave him was an act of performance, every laugh a tool to lower his guard. David believed it completely. He thought Clara was finally showing him affection because she was happy. What he didn't know was that each moment of kindness brought him closer to the end. The walls of their home, once filled with silence and indifference, now held a strange energy. To outsiders, they might have seemed like a couple finding their way back to each other, with David glowing from his unexpected good fortune and Claire appearing supportive. But inside Clara's mind, a darker story was unfolding. She was no longer simply his wife, she was his predator. As weeks passed, the opportunity she had been waiting for seemed closer. Clara studied every detail of his routine, from the time he left for work to the way he relaxed in the evenings. She noted the moments when he was most vulnerable, the times when she could act without suspicion. She considered methods, weighed risks, and eliminated options until one clear plan began to take shape. She would not just take the money, she would take his life. David sensed nothing. He only saw the version of Clara that she wanted him to see, warm, supportive, and hopeful. He trusted her completely, never realizing that trust was the very weapon she planned to use against him. And so, while David's dreams for their future grew brighter with each passing day, Clara's mind grew darker, consumed by a single thought. The money was close, but not close enough. To claim it fully, she had to erase the one person who stood in her way. She told herself it was inevitable, that it was the only way forward. Each night, as David slept beside her, unaware, Clara lay awake with her plans sharpening in her mind. What began as a flicker of greed had now become a fire, and she was ready to let it consume everything in her path. The plan had been simmering in Clara's mind for weeks, and now it had hardened into certainty. She had considered countless approaches, weighing the risks, calculating the outcomes, discarding anything that left too much to chance. A sudden accident might draw suspicion, and a staged robbery could spiral out of her control. Poison, however, was quiet. It didn't leave chaos in its wake. It was something she could manage, something she could deliver with her own hands while playing the role of a caring wife. The idea settled into her thoughts until it felt like the only possible solution. David remained blissfully unaware of her intentions. To him, Clara's sudden warmth was a relief. She had begun to prepare his favorite meals again, greeting him at the door with a smile, and even sitting with him at night when he unwound after long days. He saw these gestures as proof that the lottery win had breathed new life into their marriage. He believed that the money was already working its magic, pulling them back together after years of distance. His trust in her only deepened as she leaned into her performance. Clara, meanwhile, began making quiet preparations. She studied local pharmacies and stores, searching for what she needed without drawing attention. She eventually found the substance she believed would be effective, something that would weaken him over time, subtle enough to pass as illness. She paid in cash, tucked the bottle away in her purse, and walked home with her pulse racing. The tiny container felt heavier than it should, as though it carried not just liquid, but the weight of her decision. For days, she rehearsed in her mind how it would happen. She pictured herself slipping it into his drink, imagined how his face might look as he grew tired and unwell. She reminded herself that once it was done, she would have the money, and with it, her freedom. The thought calmed her nerves, silencing the flickers of guilt that occasionally tried to rise. To Clara, David had become little more than a barrier, and barriers were meant to be removed. The opportunity came one Friday evening after David returned from celebrating quietly with a few old friends. He had told Clara he didn't want a big party or anything that drew too much attention. He preferred simple things: an evening with the people who had stood by him through the years, a toast or two, and a promise to keep moving forward. When he came home that night, he was cheerful but tired, his steps slower than usual, his voice heavy with the warmth of alcohol. Clara saw her chance. She had already prepared his favorite meal, a gesture that touched David deeply. He sat at the table, grateful for the effort, believing this was another sign that their marriage was turning a corner. Clara set the plate before him, poured his drink, and masked her trembling hands with a calm smile. The glass in her hand carried the substance she had been hiding for weeks. With the same smoothness she had practiced in her mind, she mixed it into his drink before setting it down in front of him. As David ate and drank, Clara forced herself to remain composed. Every bite he took, every sip from the glass, brought her closer to the moment she had envisioned. She smiled when he smiled, laughed when he laughed, but inside her chest, her heart pounded like a drum. She told herself to stay steady, to act natural, to leave no trace of her fear. The effects began slowly, almost imperceptibly. David's cheerful energy dulled, replaced by a heaviness in his eyes. His laughter grew faint, his movements sluggish. He brushed it off at first, attributing it to the long day and the drinks he had shared earlier. Clara nodded, feigning concern, while inside she felt the first stirrings of triumph. As the night deepened, David's condition worsened. He leaned back in his chair, his face pale, his breath uneven. Clara played the part of a worried wife perfectly, rushing to his side, touching his arm, suggesting he lie down. To anyone watching, she appeared devoted and attentive, doing everything possible to comfort him. But inside, her thoughts were cold and focused. This was the moment she had been waiting for. Hours passed in a haze of weakness for David. His body betrayed him, slipping further into exhaustion he couldn't explain. Clara stayed close, monitoring every shift in his breathing, every flicker of his expression. When he finally collapsed, she was ready. She arranged the scene carefully, placing items where they seemed natural, ensuring nothing appeared out of place. To the outside world, it would look like a sudden medical emergency, a tragic end to an ordinary man's life. Clara sat beside him for a long time after it was done. The house was silent except for the faint ticking of the clock on the wall. She stared at him, the man she had once promised to love, now lifeless because of her own hand. A wave of unease washed over her, but she forced it away. Guilt had no place in her plan. She reminded herself of the money, of the life that was now within her grasp. She had done what she needed to do, and she told herself that made it justified. When the time came, she called for help, her voice filled with a convincing tremor. She told the story of a husband who had come home tired, grown suddenly ill, and collapsed without warning. She wept into the phone, and when the paramedics arrived, she wept again. Every tear was calculated, every sob rehearsed in her mind before it escaped her throat. To them, she looked like a devastated widow, not the orchestrator of his death. The coroner's report that followed listed the death as suspicious but inconclusive. Clara breathed a sigh of relief, believing she had escaped scrutiny. She played her role perfectly at the funeral, accepting condolences, hugging family members, and whispering about how sudden and shocking it all had been. Neighbors brought food, friends offered support, and everyone praised her strength in the face of tragedy. But even as Clara accepted their sympathy, she couldn't shake a faint unease. She noticed David's sister watching her closely, noticed the way some people whispered quietly when they thought she couldn't hear. For now, she told herself it didn't matter. The hardest part was done. The money was closer than ever, and soon she would have it all to herself. What Clara didn't know was that the very things she thought she had hidden so carefully were already beginning to surface. The trail she believed erased wasn't gone. The poison in David's body, the searches she had deleted, the inconsistencies in her story, they all lingered like shadows waiting to be revealed. Clara believed she was finally free, but the truth was that her freedom had only just begun to unravel. At first, Clara believed she had played her role flawlessly. The days after David's death passed in a blur of casseroles brought by neighbors, cards of sympathy left in the mailbox, and whispers of shock that rippled through the town. Everyone seemed convinced that David had been struck down by sudden illness, perhaps worsened by stress or exhaustion. Clara kept her mask firmly in place, moving about with red-rimmed eyes and a voice that cracked at all the right moments. She accepted condolences with trembling hands, thanked people for their kindness, and returned to an empty house each night with a look of sorrow painted across her face. On the outside, she was the grieving widow, broken and lost. On the inside, she was calculating her next steps. She wasted no time in contacting the bank, making quiet inquiries about the accounts David had opened. She posed her questions as an overwhelmed widow unsure of what to do, emphasizing her confusion to draw sympathy from the staff. To them, She appeared vulnerable, a woman left with the burden of paperwork and financial matters she had never managed before. But beneath her meek performance, Clara's mind raced with eagerness. The nearly $100,000 sat just beyond her reach, and she was determined to claim it as quickly as possible. Yet suspicion had already begun to take root, even if she didn't realize it. Elaine, David's sister, had always been protective of him. She knew their marriage had been far from perfect, and she had long suspected that Clara's feelings toward David had grown cold. At the funeral, Elaine noticed the way Clara moved, the way her tears seemed a touch too deliberate, her gestures slightly too rehearsed. Grief was unpredictable, but Clara's grief looked more like a performance than an uncontrollable wave of pain. Elaine said little at first, choosing instead to observe. It was when Elaine discovered the lottery win that her suspicions deepened. While sorting through some of David's belongings with the intention of collecting keepsakes, she stumbled across a copy of the lottery claim confirmation. She froze, staring at the amount, $99,800. It struck her as too much of a coincidence that David had died so suddenly after receiving such a windfall. The thought lodged itself in her mind and refused to leave. She began piecing together the timing, the change in Clara's demeanor, and the circumstances of his death. The more she considered it, the more convinced she became that something was wrong. Elaine reached out to the authorities, quietly voicing her concerns. At first, they were cautious. Deaths without obvious signs of violence were often left unquestioned in small towns, but her persistence made them reconsider. Detectives reviewed the case, and the coroner's initial report, which had marked the death as suspicious but inconclusive, suddenly carried new weight. Toxicology results were requested, and the examination revealed traces of substances that did not belong in David's body. The presence of poison transformed the case from tragedy to homicide. Clara, meanwhile, continued her act. She wore black, she attended church services, and she accepted sympathy from anyone willing to give it. She thought the hardest part was behind her, never realizing that a net was slowly tightening around her. The detectives began asking questions, framing them as routine follow-ups. Clara answered carefully, always emphasizing her role as a loving wife blindsided by tragedy. But the questions became sharper, more pointed. They asked about David's health, about what he had eaten the night of his death, about what medications he might have been taking. Clara felt her nerves rise but forced herself to remain calm, offering vague answers and pretending not to understand the significance of their inquiries. What she didn't know was that her digital trail was already betraying her. Though she had deleted her search history, forensic analysis recovered the data. Investigators found evidence of her late-night searches, how to poison someone without leaving evidence, how long it takes poison to work, and what happens to bank accounts after a spouse dies. Each search painted a clearer picture of intent. The detectives also uncovered surveillance footage from a pharmacy, showing Clara purchasing a small bottle that matched the substance found in David's system. She had worn a scarf and sunglasses, but her posture and features were unmistakable. The evidence was mounting, and each piece tied her closer to the crime. Elaine remained a quiet but constant force in the background, feeding investigators details about Clara's behavior in the weeks leading up to David's death. She described how Clara had seemed distant for years but suddenly affectionate once the lottery win was revealed. She recalled the way Clara had spoken about money with resentment, how she often complained that David never gave her the life she wanted. Her testimony strengthened the growing suspicion that Clara's grief was nothing more than a performance. Clara, oblivious to the extent of the investigation, began making bolder moves. She contacted a lawyer to discuss her rights to the inheritance, framing her questions as those of a confused widow trying to make sense of complicated paperwork. She requested access to David's account, citing her need to pay bills and cover expenses. Each step was noted by investigators, who were already preparing their case. As weeks turned into months, the town began to whisper. Rumors spread about the toxicology results, about the possibility that David had not died of natural causes. Neighbors who once pitied Clara began to watch her with suspicion, their sympathy cooling into doubt. She noticed the shift in their eyes, the way conversations stopped when she entered a room. The walls of the small town that had once sheltered her were now closing in. The detectives returned to question her again, this time pressing harder. They asked where she had been the night David fell ill, what she had cooked for him, why she had researched inheritance laws just days before his death. Clara tried to remain steady, repeating her story with slight variations, but each inconsistency gave the investigators more reason to doubt her. The calm mask she had worn so carefully began to crack under the weight of scrutiny. Clara's confidence wavered, but she clung to the belief that she could still outwit them. She told herself that without direct evidence, they could never prove her involvement. Yet she underestimated how much they already had: bank records showing David's recent deposit, pharmacy footage of her purchase, internet searches tying her to the method of poisoning, and testimony from those who had watched her behavior shift. The money that had seemed so close to being hers was slipping further from reach with every passing day. She had thought David's death would free her, but instead it bound her to a trail of evidence that was becoming impossible to deny. The investigation, once a quiet inquiry, had now transformed into a relentless pursuit. Clara could feel the walls closing in, though she continued to act the part of the grieving widow. What she didn't know was that the moment of truth was fast approaching. The investigators had everything they needed. They were only waiting for the right time to strike. The freedom she craved was no longer within her grasp. What lay ahead was not the life of luxury she had imagined, but the beginning of an unraveling she could no longer control. The knock at the door came early one morning, sharp and decisive. Clara had just finished pouring herself a cup of coffee when she heard it. For a brief second, she assumed it was another neighbor dropping by with condolences, but when she opened the door, two detectives stood on her porch, their faces grave and unreadable. The sight of them sent a cold ripple down her spine. She forced a smile, invited them in, and asked what they needed. They didn't waste time with small talk. They told her she was under arrest for the murder of her husband, David Henson. The words struck like a thunderclap, and for the first time since her plan had begun, Clara's mask slipped. Her hands shook as they cuffed her breath coming in shallow gasps. Neighbors who had gathered outside watched in stunned silence as the so-called grieving widow was escorted from her home. The whispers that had been circling for weeks now had proof. The woman who had played the role of the devastated wife so convincingly was revealed as a killer. The sympathy she had earned dissolved instantly, replaced with disgust and betrayal. At the police station, the interrogation room was cold and sterile. Clara tried to maintain her composure, but the evidence was overwhelming. Detectives laid everything on the table: the toxicology report showing the poison in David's system, the recovered internet searches outlining how to administer poison undetected, the surveillance footage capturing her pharmacy purchase, and the bank records that revealed her eagerness to access David's winnings immediately after his death. Each piece of evidence was like a nail sealing her coffin. Clara denied it at first, insisting she was innocent, that she had no reason to harm her husband. But her words rang hollow against the weight of the facts. She claimed the searches were out of curiosity, that the pharmacy purchase was unrelated, that her questions about the inheritance were merely practical. Yet her explanations sounded flimsy even to her own ears. The detectives didn't need her confession. They already had everything they needed to move forward. News of her arrest spread quickly through the town and beyond. Headlines painted the story in bold strokes: wife kills husband over lottery winnings, tragic windfall turns deadly, small-town greed leads to murder. The shocking betrayal fascinated the public. David's face appeared in every article, described as a hardworking man whose life had been cut short by the person he trusted most. Clara, once seen as the fragile widow, was now portrayed as a calculating murderer driven by greed. The trial was scheduled months later, and the courthouse was filled with reporters, townspeople, and curious onlookers. The prosecution laid out their case meticulously. They painted Clara as a woman dissatisfied with her life, consumed by envy, who saw her husband's win not as a blessing but as an opportunity to escape. They detailed her careful planning, the poison she purchased, the searches she conducted, and the timing of David's death so soon after the money entered his account. The jury listened in grim silence as the prosecutor described how she had prepared his final meal, smiling while slipping poison into his drink, all for the sake of a bank balance. Witnesses were called, including Elaine, who spoke passionately about her suspicions and how Clara's behavior never felt genuine. Neighbors described the sudden shift in Clara's demeanor before and after the lottery win. Experts testified about the poison found in David's system, the forensic recovery of her deleted internet history, and the surveillance footage that tied her directly to the purchase of the substance. Every detail was another thread woven into the noose tightening around her neck. Clara's defense tried to argue that the case was circumstantial, that the evidence only suggested possibilities but didn't prove intent. They painted her as a woman misunderstood, grieving, and overwhelmed, who had simply made poor choices online out of morbid curiosity. But the jury saw through it. The pattern was too clear, the timing too precise, the motive too glaring. Throughout the trial, Clara sat motionless, her face a mask of stone. Gone were the tears she had shed at the funeral. Gone was the act of the devastated widow. She listened to the testimony with cold detachment, as though she had already resigned herself to her fate. Some wondered if she felt remorse, but if she did, she never showed it. Her silence only deepened the impression that she was unrepentant, that the money had meant more to her than the man she had once vowed to love. The closing arguments sealed her fate. The prosecution reminded the jury that David had trusted Clara completely, believing her sudden kindness was genuine, when in reality it was the weapon she used to lower his guard. They emphasized the cruelty of poisoning someone slowly, watching them weaken while pretending to care. They reminded everyone of the motive, the nearly $100,000 that Clara believed was her ticket to a new life. The defense's pleas fell flat, unable to counter the mountain of evidence. When the jury returned, the courtroom held its breath. The foreman stood, his voice steady as he read the verdict, guilty of first-degree murder. The words echoed through the room, and Clara remained still, her expression unchanged. There were no tears, no outbursts, only the quiet resignation of a woman who had gambled everything on greed and lost. The judge sentenced her to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The money she killed for was seized as evidence, tied up in legal proceedings, and never came close to her hands. The reaction was swift and unforgiving. The town, once sympathetic, now spoke of her with revulsion. She was branded a monster, a cautionary tale of how greed could twist a person beyond recognition. David's memory was honored by his friends and family, who remembered him as a hardworking man who wanted nothing more than to share his good fortune. His death became a story repeated again and again, a reminder of how quickly joy could turn to tragedy when mixed with envy and betrayal. Clara began her life sentence in silence. The prison walls were stark and unyielding, a far cry from the luxurious freedom she had envisioned. The other inmates quickly learned her story, some mocking her for killing a man over less than $100,000, others shunning her for the coldness of her crime. She spent her days in a cell, the weight of her choices pressing down on her with every passing hour. The fortune she had killed for meant nothing now. It was gone, vanished like the life she once knew. In the end, Clara achieved none of what she set out for. The money didn't free her, it condemned her. Her plan, which had seemed so perfect in her mind, unraveled piece by piece until it left her exposed and broken. David's death, meant to be her liberation, became the chain that bound her to a life of confinement. The story of David and Clara lingered in the town long after the trial ended. Parents told their children about it as a warning, friends whispered about it in hushed tones, and strangers remembered it whenever they saw a lottery ticket displayed at a convenience store counter. It was a story of luck turned into misfortune, of love twisted into betrayal, and of how greed could drive someone to destroy the very thing they once claimed to cherish. David had dreamed of using his winnings to build a better life, but instead, his victory became the reason for his downfall. Clara had dreamed of freedom, but her choices locked her away forever. In the end, the money was nothing more than paper and numbers, incapable of giving either of them what they truly wanted. What it did provide was a brutal lesson, that when greed takes root, it can consume everything, leaving nothing behind but ruin.